There's a generation no one talks about anymore. Not boomers, not millennials, not Gen Z. They're the ones who fell right in between everything. The last kids to grow up without the internet. The first adults to live completely inside it. They remember rotary phones and VHS tapes, but they also built the digital world you're living in right now. They were raised by MTV, Saturday morning cartoons, and after-school specials that thought a 30-minute episode could stop you from doing drugs. They grew up during Cold War paranoia, neon lights and synthesizers, and somewhere between analog childhood and digital adulthood, they became something different, something most people don't understand. The 1980s weren't just a decade, they were a psychological experiment. And if you grew up then, you carry the results with you every single day. The 1980s weren't just neon and synthesizers. Too late for the simplicity of earlier decades. Too early for the digital comfort of later ones. They remember the Cold War, not as history, but as background noise. Nuclear drills, the threat that never came but never left. The day after, playing on TV, while their parents watched in silence. They learnt early, the world could end at any moment. But the 80s didn't feel apocalyptic. They felt electric, optimistic. America was winning, the economy was booming, and excess was celebrated. Big hair, big shoulders, big dreams. These kids watched their parents work brutal hours chasing success, saw greed is good become an actual philosophy, learned that winning meant everything, and second place meant nothing. They absorbed ambition like oxygen, and they were the first latchkey generation en masse. Mum went to work, Dad was already gone. You came home to an empty house, made your own snack, watched your own shows. Freedom? Yes. Loneliness? Also yes, but they didn't call it loneliness. They called it independence. These kids didn't have the internet. They had 3 TV channels, Saturday morning cartoons, and whatever was on the radio. And that created something rare, shared culture. Every kid watched the same shows, knew the same commercials, sang the same songs. There was no algorithm customizing content. You got what everyone got. That built a different kind of connection. You didn't have to explain the reference. Everyone knew it. They also grew up in the peak of stranger danger. Faces on milk cartons, after-school specials about bad touches, Just Say No campaigns that made everything seem dangerous. The message was clear, don't trust anyone. But at the same time, they had more freedom than any generation since. You left in the morning, came back when the streetlights came on. No one knew where you were. No one tracked you. You learnt to navigate the world without supervision. They were also the first gaming generation. Not mobile games, not online games, arcade games, Nintendo. Games you had to master because there were no tutorials, no online guides, no saves. You figured it out or you failed. Simple. And they watched their heroes, the athletes, the musicians, the movie stars become larger than life. No scandals leaked on Twitter, no controversies trending, just mythology. They believed in heroes because the internet hadn't dismantled them yet. I remember the moment I realized how different our childhood was. I was talking to someone born in the late 90s, and they asked, how did you make plans without phones? And I had to explain. You called the landline, hoped someone was home, made a plan, and then you just showed up, because if you didn't, there was no way to cancel. Your word was literally all you had. I remember waiting, so much waiting, waiting for your favorite song to play on the radio, so you could record it, waiting for the TV show that aired once a week, and if you missed it, you missed it. Everything felt more valuable because it was scarce, and I remember the shift, watching the first computers come into homes, getting the first cell phones, the internet arriving like a slow invasion. We adapted, but we remember before. That makes us translators. We can explain dial-up to teenagers and TikTok to our parents. We code switch between analog and digital fluently. But part of us still lives in 1987. Psychologists have studied the 1980s kids extensively. They call them the bridge generation, or analog natives, digital immigrants. Here's what they found. High self-reliance. They were raised to figure things out. No one was hovering. No one was solving problems for them. So they learned, if something's broken, fix it yourself. So they believe things can be great, but know it'll cost you. Brand loyalty. They're the most brand-loyal generation, because in the 80s brands meant something. Nike wasn't just shoes, it was identity. And once you chose, you stayed. High tolerance for boredom. They didn't have constant stimulation, so they can sit with silence, can entertain themselves, don't need the dopamine hit every 30 seconds. And here's the trait psychologists find most interesting. Nostalgia as coping mechanism. Children of the 80s return to that decade more than any other generation returns to theirs. The music, the movies, the aesthetic. Not because it was objectively better, but because it felt safer. The world was smaller then, manageable, before everything became too much. People who grew up in the 1980s are often dismissed as stuck in the past, clinging to nostalgia, unable to move on. But here's what they actually are: adaptable. They've lived through every technological shift, from no computers to AI, from 3 TV channels to infinite streaming, and they adapted every time. Resourceful. They were raised to make do, to fix things, to figure it out without Googling the answer. Loyal. To brands, to people, to ideas. Once they commit, they stay. That's rare now. Resilient to chaos. They were raised during the last gasp of the Cold War, the AIDS crisis, economic whiplash. They know how to function when the world feels unstable. And here's the strength no one talks about. They remember a world without constant connectivity. They know what it's like to be unreachable, to have privacy that wasn't a setting you had to configure, to have a life that wasn't documented. That gives them perspective most generations don't have. They can see what's been gained and what's been lost, but growing up in the 80s also created contradictions. They value independence but crave community, because they were latchkey kids who learnt to be alone, but also felt the loneliness. They're nostalgic but forward-thinking. They love the past but don't actually want to live there. They just want to remember when things felt less complicated. They're optimistic but guarded. They were told they could be anything, then watched their parents burn out chasing that dream. They're analog at heart but digital by necessity. They adapted because they had to. But their instinct is still to pick up the phone and call, not text. They live between 2 worlds, always have. And they're starting to realize their childhood is history now. The references they make land as retro. The music they grew up with is classic rock. The kids they were watching cartoons, playing outside until dark, recording songs off the radio. That's not coming back. And maybe that's okay. Because what they carry from that decade isn't just nostalgia, it's resilience, adaptability, the ability to function without constant input. They were the last generation to grow up one way, the first to live another. Runsapund Togindre comes. Latchkey loneliness, the pressure to succeed, the constant mixed messages, be independent but don't fail, dream big but work harder, question authority but obey the rules. They were raised by a culture that told them winning was everything, then sent them into a world where the rules kept changing. Some of them never learned to ask for help, because asking meant weakness, and weakness meant losing. But here's the gift. They know how to be alone without being lonely. They can navigate change because they've done it 100 times. They value connection because they remember when it required effort. They don't take technology for granted because they remember life without it. And when the power goes out, when the Wi-Fi dies, when the systems fail, they're the ones who know how to keep going. Because they were raised in a world where nothing was guaranteed, and they survived anyway. Dronach's psychology of people who grew up in the 1980s isn't just about nostalgia for neon and synthesizers. It's about being shaped by a specific moment, the last breath of the analog world, the first steps into the digital one. They were told the future would be amazing, and it is, but it's also exhausting, overwhelming, and infinitely more complicated than Saturday morning cartoons. If you grew up in the 80s, you already know this. You've been called stuck in the past, told to let it go, asked why you still care about things from 40 years ago. But you're not stuck, you're remembering when things felt simpler, when your biggest worry was whether you'd beat the level before your mum made you turn off the Nintendo. And that memory? It's not weakness, it's anchor. In a world that moves too fast, you remember when slow was normal, when waiting was expected, when boredom wasn't something to fix. And that makes you stronger than you think. Did you grow up in the 1980s? What's one thing from that decade that shaped who you are today? Drop it in the comments. Let's see what we all carry. If this took you back, hit subscribe, we remember. And if you've ever been told to get over the 80s, leave a like. You don't need to get over it. You need to honor what it gave you.